Good evening. Bonsoir. I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you for your lovely invitation to bring me to your beautiful city. Nashville, like Paris in 1900, has a reputation for the beauty of its city, for its food and its nightlife. And dare I say that you might have a slightly warmer hospitality than Paris. So I'm just loving your city and delighted to be here. I also want to add my thanks to our colleagues in Paris who first conceived of the show back in 2014. And then hats off to Susan Edwards, who had the brilliant idea to bring it to an American audience. The Frist has the honor of being the first venue in the United States. That also means that Katie and Susan had to work about twice as hard as the rest of us, ironing out any little wrinkles, figuring out installation, and we're so grateful to have them as partners. So it's a pleasure to see the show here. I hope I might be able to see it in Cincinnati, and then I invite you to come see it in Portland and come see me again. And I would love to welcome you to our city. When I was getting coffee today, the fellow getting my order for me said that Nashville has been called the Portland of the East. Have you heard that? Is that a thing? He was very hip. He had this little fisherman's cap, and I commented he was serving me coffee made in Portland, so we started up that conversation. So it was a meeting of the minds. Before I begin, I'm just curious, so who's seen the show? Who's been in? Okay. And who here has been to Paris? Oh, wow. Okay. So those of you who've been to Paris, has anyone been to the Petit or the Grand Palais? Okay, has anyone ridden the metro? Okay, has anyone been to the Musée d'Orsay? Okay, which of course was a train station back then. You have experienced some of the glory of Paris 1900. And a lot of the show is about how the city was transformed at that moment. And when we think of Paris, a lot of what we think of comes from that moment in time. So let's have a look. In the year 1900, Paris was the self-proclaimed capital of the world. Now, I love to repeat that because it's not that Paris thought, hey, we're a pretty nice place, or we're a good European capital, or even we are one of the premier cities of the Western Hemisphere, but they had the audacity to state we are the capital of the world. Now, as outrageous as that sounds, they did in fact have good reason for their pride. Following the humiliating loss to the Germans of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, the French established a new government known as the Third Republic. And under the first decades of basically up until World War I, the Third Republic, time under the Third Republic was characterized by peace, prosperity, and a great sense of French innovation and optimism about the future. Art students from around the world, and especially a ton of Americans, flocked to Paris to study at the École des Beaux-Arts or private academies like the Académie Julienne. Tourists and Parisians alike praise the city for its fine gastronomy and its elegant restaurants, and the best-dressed women of Europe, and America too, donned the designs of the exclusive French designers, while writers, poets, and dandies gathered to discuss art and ideas in the famous literary salons. In addition, France was becoming more technologically minded and boasted modern improvements to the city's infrastructure with things like sewers, subway, and electricity, things we take for granted. French engineering was also gaining renown, as witnessed by Mr. Gustave Eiffel's tower and the little statue he built for us in America, of course, the Statue of Liberty. To top it off, Paris had the wildest entertainment scene in Europe, and rich and poor alike could enjoy a vast variety of entertainments from the early morning to late in the night. Now, the optimism was so high that French progress seemed inevitable and unlimited. We know now that this golden age came to a crashing halt with the onset of World War I, but looking back, we see these years of 1871 to 1940 as a beautiful time, that's where we get our expression, Belle Époque. This vision of Paris is so enduring that it has entered the realm of myth, and it still speaks to us 100 years later. Tonight, we will take a look at the pleasures of Paris that gave the French the confidence to declare themselves the center of the world. Along the way, we will look at the key ingredients to the allure of Paris, themes that are described in this exhibition in 6 sections. They are 1, the Exposition Universelle of 1900, 2, the profusion of Art Nouveau designs, 3, Paris as a center of the arts, 4, the appeal of La Parisienne, the French woman, 5, the streets of Paris, and then finally we will end with the scintillating nightlife of Gay Paris. So let's start with an exploration of Paris 1900 with a trip to the Exposition Universelle, or the World's Fair. The French, as I mentioned above, had significant national pride and were happy to show off to the world their superior art, customs, cuisine, and joie de vivre. The best way to show off, of course, is to throw a party and invite the entire world. And the French excelled in this arena. They had hosted their first international exposition in 1855, displaying their finest in art, industry, and design. Every decade thereafter, they held another extravagant exposition, holding fairs in 1855, 1867, 1878, and then in 1889, for which the Eiffel Tower was constructed. So adept was Paris at staging fairs, the French capital earned the title Queen City of Expositions. And this image, let's see, let me go back one, that you see here, even though this is Paris 1900, what you're seeing here is Paris 1889 at the Great World's Fair. As the turn of the century approached, all the European capitals were thinking the same thing. They're thinking, who's going to get the coveted spot for 1900? And Berlin thought, we haven't had a World's Fair. This is our turn. So they started preparing for a fair. And if there's one thing all Frenchmen could agree upon, it was that there was no way they were going to lose out to the Germans on throwing this big party. So a Congress was hastily assembled, and this decision was rushed through, basically with the sole purpose of snatching that position away from their friends in Berlin. So Paris won the date, and they realized that for the year 1900, it was such a significant date that they needed to position a show that would basically, what they hoped to do was sum up the entire 19th century and inaugurate the 20th. So a big call and high ambitions, but in other words, it was the perfect opportunity for them to stage a spectacle and celebration to showcase what they felt made France, and specifically Paris, such an important place. Now, to prepare for the fair, here we go. Here we see a view of the fair, and you can see how much of the city it entailed. Now, to prepare for the fair, the city was transformed. Perhaps the most significant undertaking was the construction of the underground subway line known as the Metro. Paris was far behind her rivals in this regard. London had debuted the first underground system back in 1863, followed by Chicago, New York, Vienna, and Berlin. Paris had actually been planning a subway system since the early 1880s, but they were so mired in bureaucracy that nothing had taken place. When the world came to their doorstep for the 1889 World's Fair, the congestion was overwhelming. And so once they won the position for the 1900 fair, they returned to this project with a renewed sense of urgency. They did so, however, only in 1898, giving themselves very little time to prepare. I love these images in the show. These two paintings show us the immense undertaking the construction of the metro was. Now, today the French metro is the second busiest in the world. It's second after Moscow. And we love it. I think it's the best metro system I use. But you have to remember what a colossal pain it was for the Parisians at the time it was built. So here you can see how main thoroughfares were completely dug up, lives were rearranged, it was noisy, it was messy, and it also involved really extreme human labor. So you can see this valorization of the physical work required to create this vast subterranean network. To welcome people into the Underground Railway, architect Hector Guimard was commissioned to design the entrances, which featured organic forms, sculptural use of cast iron, and large panes of glass. This curvilinear style, called Art Nouveau, was all the rage in Belle Epoque Paris, and it might be one of the most recognizable symbols of that time today. When the first line of the metro was inaugurated in July 1900, a little bit late for the opening of the fair, the French had yet another reason to boast about the amenities of their beautiful capital city, and visitors had a new means to travel to the Exposition Universelle. Now, let's take a tour of that World's Fair. And here you see a map of the fair. You see it's right in the heart of Paris. It had sort of two main axes here along the Pont Alexandre, Tois, which we'll talk about, and here, and I'm sorry, I can't remember which bridge that is. If someone with better eyes can yell it out. And then it was united by the Seine River. So this formed sort of the connecting piece. It opened on April 14th, 1900. 42 nations and 25 colonies were represented with 83,047 exhibits, ranging from art to agriculture to technology. The exhibition was housed in the very heart of Paris. As you see here, in the painting on the right by Francois Fleming, he depicts an allegory of fame proudly seated in front of an oculus that opens into the wide perspective offered by the Champ de Mars and the Eiffel Tower. Both sides of the Seine were arrayed with a magnificent row of buildings representing visiting nations, and more exhibitions took place on the axis connecting the Petit and the Grand Palais to the Esplanade des Invalides. A great summation of this setting comes from the wonderful Larousse dictionary, the encyclopedia, and the Larousse proclaimed that the exhibition of 1900 was a memorable orgy of all human emotions. And they continue, writing, the influx of cultured people to this Babel on the Seine turns it into a playground for all mankind. And indeed, it seems like almost all of mankind did show up. There were over 51 million visitors, which for perspective is more than the entire population of France at the time. So how do we enter? How would one get into this show? Naturally, through this strange, exuberant, monumental gate. The Porte Monumentale consisted of a 40-meter-high construction, and you'll see there are 4 minarets surrounded by 3 joined arches. It was built in contemporary iron, like the Eiffel Tower, but it had been controversial in their time, so the architect Rene Lalique decided to hedge his bets. And he had this magnificent iron structure, and then he completely covered it in plaster and added all these rich jewel-like tones and made it seem like a beautiful encrusted jewel. Now, inside the dome were ticket offices, 58 ticket windows, and it allowed 1,040 visitors per minute to enter the fairgrounds. Crowning the structure, just here was a magnificent structure of a woman. of the ideal Parisian woman. And she's wearing a blue ball gown. You can see in the show there's a print that shows this in color. She's wearing a blue ball gown from the Paquin fashion house, and she is proudly declaring France's supremacy in fashion and luxury goods. The presence of this figure served to remind visitors that Parisian women were among the most important elements of the city's mythic appeal. They set the tone in the world of fashion, and their style and manners were emulated the world over. Their refined silhouettes inspired writers, artists, and fashion designers alike. In sum, the Parisienne was a key ingredient of the mythology of Belle Epoque Paris, a theme that will recur throughout this talk. Now, once inside the fairgrounds, thousands of exhibits and spectacles competed for the visitors' attention. On the right bank, not far from the Champs-Élysées, architects and engineers were at work on two magnificent buildings, the Grand Palais and the Petit Palais, which were designed to house the art exhibitions of the fair and then were to be permanent homes for art after that. Now, they're very serious about their French arts. The dedication on the Grand Palais reads that this building is dedicated by the Republic to the glory of French art. Now, like the Metro, these buildings were begun quite late in the game. They were started in 1897, allowing for just 3 short years for a project of great complexity. Now, the panorama of this site gives a sense of the vast scale, but no hints of the difficulties of the undertaking. For instance, one of the biggest surprises was that as building progressed, they discovered that the land facing the River Seine could not support the weight of these tremendous buildings. And so there was no recourse except for to build an artificial foundation. So they had to pound 3,400 oak piles into the soft fluvial soil to continue their construction. Once they did, the marvelous engineering structures could get to work, as well as the work of the masons. Now, the task was enormous. On the Grand Palais, the facade alone required 17,000 cubic meters of stone, 10,000 cubic meters of rubble, and 2 million bricks. To win the race against time, the most modern technology was used, as well as plenty of manual labor. At the peak of the construction work, there were 1,500 laborers. Of course, they went on strike, so they had yet another hurdle to, the French, they know how to strike. They got past that, and they opened on time. I love this slide because you see the iron, kind of the iron skeleton of the building. For comparison, they required 8,500 tons of steel for the Grand Palais, while the Eiffel Tower had required just 8,000 pounds. So it gives tons. So it gives you an idea of what we're dealing with. Happily, both buildings, and miraculously, both buildings were finished on time. Critics hailed the elegant forms, the impressive dome, and the blending of classical and Art Nouveau designs. Both the Grand Palais and the Petit Palais were monuments to French engineering, combining this rare combination of steel, glass, and masonry. And they were beautiful venues to highlight the fine arts at the fair. But to connect, now they had another problem because they needed to connect this part of Paris to the left bank. And to do so, a beautiful new bridge was constructed, the Pont Alexandre Tois, named after the Tsar of Russia, in a gesture celebrating a recent alliance between Russia and France. It's a technological marvel. It just bounds across the river in one span, a single spanning arch of more than 350 feet. The bridge is, some would say, richly decorated. Some might say over-decorated. Not me. I'd never say that. With Art Nouveau lampposts, marble swags, and a series of sculptures by some of the most famous artists of the Third Republic. This exhibition has marvelous little terracotta models, just about the size of a guinea pig, in the exhibition, and it's so fun to compare them to the finished marble works that you can see here in this snapshot taken by a tourist during the fair, and you can tell by the little boater hats that it is in fact 1900. But these marvelous lions guard the entrance to the bridge. Now, to reach all these impressive features at the fair, one could mount the trottoir roulant, or the moving sidewalk. And I have to laugh because I came through O'Hare to get here, and you always hear the moving sidewalks are ending. I mean, moving sidewalks to me now mean a long run through the airport, but in 1900 they were a wonderful addition to the fair. It featured parallel platforms. There are two platforms. There was a slow lane and a fast lane. And it completed a complete circuit around the fair, and you could step on and off at these different like little subway stops. And here we see some well-dressed fairgoers. They're sliding past the Italian pavilion. If you preferred to just stay on the whole time to get an overview, you could complete the entire circuit in 30 minutes on the fast track and 60 minutes on the slower track. So this photograph gives us a good idea of what it looked like and how it functioned, but I prefer Félix Vallotton's interpretation because he gives us a better idea of the thrill and the excitement and moreover the crush of people on the moving sidewalk. In the first month alone, the moving sidewalk was used by 479 paying passengers. There were more wonders at the fair, and I wish I had time to show you them all. Katie and I have laughed that the World's Fair could be a whole exhibition on itself. But I want to make sure I show you some of the scientific marvels, because it was very important for the French in their self-fashioning to think of themselves as leaders in science and industry. Here on the left, you see a hand-colored slide or postcard of the Palace of Electricity. And there's a wonderful shot of it in the movie, in the show that you'll want to see. It provided power for the entire fair. And at night, the facade was illuminated with a light show that took over 5,000 lamps to produce. Now, electricity was not exclusive to France, but this elaborate monument and the widespread use of electrical power at the fair brought great fame to Paris and situated it as a center for technological innovation. Nearby, the optical palace, seen here in a poster, was one of the most visited of all pavilions at the fair and heightened Paris's reputation as a center for science. So once these 51 million people had visited the fair, toured the exhibits, gawked at the scientific marvels, ridden the moving sidewalk, admired the splendid architecture, and dined at one of the 1,000 restaurants, what do you think they want to do? Gift shop. So it's natural that they'd want to take something home. And you could choose from all sorts of wonderful displays. Here is a folding fan that would help you with the heat and provide a map. A dinner plate of the monumental gate. A puzzle. There are 3 puzzles in this exhibition. Sheet music. You'll notice that this prominently features La Parisienne and the Palace of Electricity there, all lit up. A liquor service, perhaps, might be more to your liking, a perfume bottle, or a pop-up view. Now, I include these because they're wonderful tourist souvenirs, but we should also remember that they're very savvy advertising products as well. For when people returned home with these visions and memories of experiences and their commemorative handkerchiefs, they're also serving to perpetuate this notion of Paris as a city of spectacle and celebration. Their experiences help spread the reputation of Paris as the capital of the world. But now let's take a look and see what else was happening at the time that really gave the French reasons to brag. And we'll turn our attention to Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau was an international artistic style characterized by a whiplash line, extravagant arabesques, and picturesque asymmetry, and a devotion to ornament. Artists looked to the natural world as a source of inspiration, and they sought to forge a new art free from historical baggage. Parisians got their first taste of this style in 1895 at the shop called L'Art Nouveau, which is how this style got its name in France. Soon other shops opened. I show you this marvelous poster from La Maison Moderne, which was a rival to L'Art Nouveau. And what I love about this poster is it really gives you a sense of the sort of things you'd find there. So wonderful little decorative objects, this beautiful hair comb, two of them, her elaborate collar and jewels, the chair, the woman herself looks like she is part of the decor. It's interesting because Art Nouveau also served a very nationalistic purpose. The French considered themselves to, the style, even though it was an international style, the French considered Art Nouveau to be quintessentially French. And its emphasis on fine craftsmanship and luxury, they thought, was at the heart of their self-identification. Art Nouveau became a wellspring for national pride and demonstrated, they believed, the triumph of French taste over her more gauche rivals. And by that, you should read German. For many people, Art Nouveau is most closely associated with the decorative arts. On the left, you see the marvelous pinecone chalice crafted by Rene Lalique. And you may know him for his glass, but Lalique was renowned as an Art Nouveau jeweler. And around 1900, he turned his attention to glass and glass blowing. This chalice was produced at the turning point of his career and shows his established prowess as a silversmith together with his growing talent in crafting glass. In addition to plant life, animals and especially insects were popular motifs for Art Nouveau artists. On the right, we see the beetle vase. You can see our wonderful little creature right here, which features an elegant, attenuated shape, richly glowing colored glass, and sensitive renditions of both plant and animal life. Art Nouveau was not limited to the small decorative arts, however. Some of the finest creations in this style come from furniture designers who sought to create a complete environment, from wallpaper to the chairs, to the lighting, to the objects in the modern home, even to the clothing that the modern lady of the home would wear. This total environment, what the Germans would call a Gesamtkunstwerk, is brilliantly seen in Henri Sauvage's interior. Sauvage was trained as an architect at the École des Beaux-Arts, and he had a dual career in the decorative arts. And that's a really interesting part of the whole Art Nouveau phenomenon. You had artists working across disciplines. So they might be trained as an architect, but they're also doing graphic arts or jewelry design or furniture. In 1899, he was commissioned to design and decorate two lounges at the Café de Paris. And this represents the Mauve Salon, which was saved from the Wrecking Ball and is now has a home in the Musée Carnavalet, and actually for the next few months has a home here at the Frist. Art Nouveau, as I mentioned, was extremely flexible design vocabulary. So we saw it in architecture and decorative arts. It was also a great tool for the graphic arts. And as we see in these posters, in Belle Époque Paris, Art Nouveau posters could be found throughout the city. They were pasted up on billboards, on the sides of construction sites, on specially designed columns. Those round columns are called Morris columns. They were even pasted up on urinals and on the backs of sandwich board men. And they could advertise anything from this extremely refined play featuring Sarah Bernhardt to cigarette papers or writing ink. And they often would feature a motif of a woman with elaborate, curly, flowing hair. And this will come back to again and again as this French fascination with the Parisian woman. So we'll be back to that. Another interesting notion about these Art Nouveau posters is that it meant that the style was diffused throughout the city. The objects I showed you before were only available to the very wealthy. They were done in small quantities, they used precious materials, but these posters could be seen by anyone who walked the streets of Paris. And in this way, it really widely diffused the style, and it made it seem available to all Parisians. Now, let's move to Paris as the capital of the arts. As you no doubt already know, the fine arts were another key element in the fame of Paris in Belle Époque. The energy of the city's artists and their patron were unparalleled. It really was an artistic babel, and the City of Light seemed to exert a pull that no other European capital had on young artists. Although the art scene in 1900 was large and varied, the fame of its best-known figures, Claude Monet, for instance, Auguste Rodin, has obscured this diversity, overshadowing many artists whose work is worthy of our attention today. One of the greatest strengths of the show, I think, is how the curators brought to light so many artists who enjoyed contemporary fame, but who are almost entirely unknown to audiences today. As a curator, I love to be surprised, and this show is full of surprises, so I hope you enjoy that too. So before we examine some of these more obscure artists, let's start with some of the big names. Here you see a painting by Camille Pissarro, one of the original members of the Impressionists. Parisian cityscapes were one of his favorite themes, and in the first decades of the 20th century, Pissarro painted several views of the Louvre and the Tuileries Gardens. This canvas was painted from the window of a hotel overlooking the Quai Voltaire on the left bank, where the artist found this elevated viewpoint. The composition is organized around the massive bridge at the center of the canvas, with the Seine River beneath it and the towers of the Louvre above. Interestingly, this is a very quiet picture. You don't sense the hustle and bustle of the city. Pissarro here is interested in the play of light and the movement of the water and the sky, rather than the chaotic scenes of modern Paris, as we'll see in other work. You are also likely familiar with the work of fellow Impressionists Auguste Renoir, whose portrait of Madame de Bonnières is on the left, and the work of Berthe Morisot. Both canvases, you will note, feature beautiful young women, and both show off the painter's ability to depict dewy skin, shimmery fabrics, and lush flower petals. Female beauty was much exalted at the time, and portraits, whether of society women, such as Renoir's image, or anonymous models, as in Morisot's image here, were a staple of the Parisian art world. The French woman, as we will see, was more than just an object of fascination. She was the center of an almost cult-like devotion. But I don't want you to get the idea that women were only models. They were also talented artists. Although the art world had long been closed to women, in the Belle Époque, female artists gained a tiny measure of ground. On the left, you see a portrait of Angèle de la Salle by her teacher, Benjamin Constant. And de la Salle was an accomplished painter and the recipient of a silver medal at the 1900 World's Fair. On the right is a portrait of American Mary Cassatt, who, together with Berthe Morisot, were the best-known women in the Impressionist circle. Now, the great irony, of course, is that I'm showing you works painted by men to prove that women artists were getting some attention, but it's the best I could do. This helps, though. This wonderful sculpture here on the left, the scale is so much bigger than I imagined, is a bronze by the Madame Léon Berthaud, and it has a wonderful title. It's entitled Psyche Under the Empire of Mystery. That's pretty good. Berthaud founded the Union of Women Painters and Sculptors in 1890. And it was an association that fought for, in 1880, and it was an association that fought for women to be admitted to the École des Beaux-Arts. It took 17 years to achieve that goal. And it was another 6 years before women were allowed to compete for the Prix de Rome, the most prestigious art prize awarded by the French government. Many women artists, if they weren't, before they were allowed to attend the École des Beaux-Arts, they would train in academies and at the private studios of famous artists. And Camille Claudel, for example, was one such female student. She studied with Auguste Rodin, who is pictured here in a bust from 1897. So although we Americans are most familiar with Impressionism as the reigning style at the time, that is not, in fact, entirely accurate. The world in 1900 was extremely diverse, the art world, and Impressionism is a very small slice of that artistic pie. Another huge component of it was symbolism, a style that emphasized feeling, emotion, and mystery, and is on beautiful display in works such as this by Lewis Weldon Hawkins in a canvas entitled My Patron Saint. Hawkins was born in Germany to an English mother and an Austrian father. He was attracted to Paris, where he studied at the Académie Julienne and took French nationality. His canvas combines elements of the supernatural, such as the wonderful glow of the saint's nimbus, as well as everyday quotidian aspects as seen in the careful delineation of how the light plays across stone. That's a very Parisian bridge, and the light coming through the leaves, on the water, and on the ground. Fernand Palais, or Palais, represents another style, what we might call academic realism. Palais was a Frenchman of Spanish descent who specialized in scenes of the urban underclass. Each canvas, Palais once said, was a page in the book in which he had written the story of the Parisian poor. One critic said that Palais was unable to make any painting in which the word misery did not play a starring role. This one, surprisingly, does not have the word misery in it. It's simply called, I think, the Violet Cellar. Is that right? Yeah. Why don't we say the Violet Cellar, misery? He was especially adept at depicting children, such as the young Violet Cellar we see here. And you'll notice all sorts of touching and disturbing details. His head is cut very, very short. His hair is shorn to discourage lice and scabies. This image of Belle Epoque Paris doesn't accord with this mythical view that we carry around in our heads, but homeless children and poverty-stricken families were common sights in the city. The massive building projects that make Paris such a delightful place for us to visit also displaced about 350,000 people, most of them working poor. Such canvases remind us of the cost and consequences of this kind of growth. Now, Paris was also the center of European printmaking during the Belle Epoque. The 1890s are considered a high point for the graphic arts, especially in the world of color lithography. Are there any printmakers here? No? Oh, there we go. Okay, thankful. I thought for a minute we forgot to invite the printmakers. So the printmakers will tell you that lithography was invented in Bavaria in the 1790s. The French, however, couldn't quite countenance the fact that the Germans had invented it. So they were getting ready, when Germany was getting ready to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of, we don't know when in the 1790s it was invented, probably 1794, 1795, right around in there. The French decided to get a jump on the Germans, and they had a centennial celebration in 1893. So if that sounds a little familiar about being competitive against their artistic rivals. Because lithographs are multiple originals, the price points for original art was much lower than for paintings. Print subscription services such as L'Estampe Originale, which you see here, offered subscribers quarterly installments of prints by the leading artists of the day. You might be able to tell this one's not too bad. Most of these have a central fold line. This was like your free little wrapper that you'd put your prints in. If you had subscribed in the 1890s to this publication, you would be very happy today, believe me. Prints were sold in galleries and were seen on the streets. And this fabulous print here depicts Parisian beauties examining the latest prints at the Gallery of Edmond Sagot, a gallery that's still in operation now in its 5th generation in Paris today. Now, another recurring theme, you as astute viewers may also know that these prints feature women, and that is going to be our transition to our next section. It is all about the French obsession with depicting, defining, and debating the ideal Parisian woman, la Parisienne. Now, Katie has installed this picture at the start of the exhibition where it's a beautiful welcome, but she could fit in a number of different categories. You could put her in the Art Nouveau room maybe, but I wanted to put her in my talk at least in this section on La Parisienne. Let's kind of unpack this notion of what does that mean, the ideal French woman. And this painting will help us get started on that conversation. Since medieval times, the motto of Paris had been fluctuat net mergator, which means it rocks but it does not capsize. And you see these Latin words inscribed up here. And the emblem for the city of Paris was a boat, referring to the importance of the River Seine in trade and the development of the city. Now, this artist decided to replace the boat or embellish the boat with the figure of a young Parisian woman. She stands on the prow here, and she's got a wonderful boat on her bodice, and she is now representing the city of Paris. She's dressed in the latest fashions, and you'll see she has wonderful but altogether impossible proportions. When you go into the exhibition, try to figure out the distance from hip to knee. And I love those long arms, but I'm not sure they make them like that anymore. So if this seems familiar, this ideal Parisian in a prominent place, casting out over Paris, let's just take one step back. And you'll remember our Parisienne from the Monumental Gate. Now, the symbolic use of the Parisienne in literature and in art and here at the World's Fair was meant to inscribe an idea of ideal femininity and norms of behavior. It was meant to instruct women on their proper role. At the fair, the Parisienne was also used to fulfill nationalistic ambitions. The elegantly attired woman was intended to promote Paris as a center of luxury fashion and style, and thereby support the economic growth. Moreover, the sculpture of the Parisienne on the gate also fulfilled an evolutionary concept that fed French pride. Now, this is really weird, but stay with me. You see, the architect of the gate was widely influenced by the work of evolutionary biologist Ernst Haeckel. The gate bears a strong resemblance to the images of microscopic animals in Haeckel's work. And in fact, the design may have been based on Haeckel's illustrations published in his book entitled Report on Radiolaria, a magnificent 3-part volume on these microscopic plankton illustrated in the image here on the right. In this way, the gate was understood as an example of the evolutionary process, starting with the lowest order, the single-celled organisms, and progressing to creation's greatest creature of all, the Parisian woman. Now let's examine what this meant in daily life. What was the Parisienne in daily life? For starters, the Parisienne was expected to be a very visible manifestation of the city's place at the forefront of the world's luxury fashion industry. Artists at this time took great pains to describe the drape of the fabric, the arch of a plumed hat, and the details of lace, embroidery, ruffles, and jewels that bedecked the fashions of the time. This artist, Antonio della Guardia, was one of the premier portraitists of the Parisian elite, and he captures all these things as well as her elegant silhouette just to perfection. His portraits serve not only to commemorate the image of the person depicted, but also to enshrine her status as a woman of taste, refinement, and display. Portraits were also an important part in the dissemination of the latest fashions. And here is another object that could move around with ease in this exhibition. You see here the famed stage actress. She was a French woman, but she adopted an English name of Jane Hadding. And in the late 19th century, actresses became the style setters for women of all social strata. Hadding nurtured relationships with the top fashion houses in Paris, who produced exquisite custom-made gowns for her. She benefited from the stylish attire, while the fashion house capitalized on her international fame. Postcards like the one you see on the right functioned both as souvenirs of the beautiful actress, as well as fashion plates for the women who would collect them and, depending on their budget, emulate her fashions. Here, as in other areas of the exhibition, you see this recurring motif of French pride as demonstrated by Jane Hadding: elegance, luxury, the performing arts, and entertainment. Moreover, the luxury of her apartment, as seen in this portrait, wonderful details like this Japanese folding screen in the back, recall France's claim to be the center of design and interior style. I can't go past fashion without pointing out that the Parisienne was expected to be fashionable from the tips of her toes out all the way to the fan she held in her fingertips, giving designers in Paris a huge range of materials in which to work. Shopping was also considered an important part of the Parisienne's day, and she would dress in specific outfits for this task. Much passion was for this idea of the Parisienne that sculptors came up with little figurines suitable for collecting and display. I'm tempted to call them action figures, but there's not a whole lot of action involved unless you consider that action shopping, attending a ball, or receiving visitors in your home. So the outfits and activities were very, very much prescribed, like this is what you must wear when doing this activity. This is also seen in their role as shoppers. And we sometimes think of shopping as a dismissive activity, but at the time, shopping was considered an important part of the Parisienne's mandate. On the poster on the left here is a wonderful Art Nouveau poster. You see a fashionable Parisienne. Look at that hat. Isn't that something? And she's at the January white sale being attended to by another fashionable Parisienne. And the designer here just went nuts with this fabulous array of fabric showing us these wonderful curves. And in this way, she is considered to be doing her duty of upholding the French home. This color lithograph here is by an artist named Lunois, and it depicts the Bon Marché department store. Department stores were invented by the French in the 1860s, and they were celebrated as a particular domain of the women. Now, someone in here, I bet, had to read Zola's Au Bonheur des Dames in French high school class. So, no one? Okay, well, you should read it now. It's translated as the Ladies' Paradise. So shopping, whenever I go into a mall, I try to remind myself, oh, the Ladies' Paradise. But it was seen as a key economic development, and thus these women are doing their patriotic role. So this cult of the Parisienne goes to the point of, I would say, almost to the absurd, maybe just short, and that is wonderfully exemplified in the case displaying these 10 postcards, which we think are satirical. What do you think, Katie? Yeah. So they depict the hours of a Parisienne's day. And first, lucky lady sleeps until 9. And then the morning is full of household duties. So she might oversee her staff. She has breakfast. She gets dressed to go out. She comes back for tea or some such, new outfit for a promenade, then yet another meal, an evening at the theater, and gets to bed just before 2 a.m. Now, as kind of absurd and laughable as that seems to us today, I would contend that we have not gotten over it. And it took me all of about 2 seconds to come up with this slide showing you that we are still wondering, how do those French ladies do it? Everything from child rearing to dining to fashion to style. And this is a little look into my past. When I went to Paris in 1998 to do my dissertation research, my advisor gave me this book, and it's called How to Become a True Parisienne. So I bring this up, it's sort of a silly aside, but I just want to point to the fact that we are still deeply invested in this idea that started in the Belle Epoque of the Parisienne as an elegant, savvy woman blessed with a certain je ne sais quoi. So the quintessential Parisian would not, of course, sit home alone. She would be out about in the city for a walk in Paris, on the streets of Paris. Strolling in Paris was considered a great pleasure offered by the city and one that contributed mightily to its status as the capital of the world. This section of the exhibition examines the rituals of a walk in Paris from the great parks and to the busy neighborhoods. The painting on the right of the screen by Abel Truchet shows us, I can't tell my right from my left. The left side here shows us the most famous of all Parisian thoroughfares, the Champs-Élysées. Bordered by trees, broad sidewalks, and sandy areas with movable chairs, the Champs-Élysées was one of the key locations to promenade. Fashionable men, women, and even this delightful child with her toy horse display themselves in Parisian style. On the right, we see another corner of the city, the Boulevard Montmartre. It was one of the focal points of Parisian life, both during the day and at night. The most famous boulevard theaters were a short distance away, as were many cafes and other pleasure spots. In this painting, the artist depicts the mid-afternoon liveliness of the boulevard. It's bustling here with men in top hats, and they're speaking amongst themselves or reading newspapers. On the right, a newspaper vendor offers his wares to a gentleman in a top coat right here on the margin, while the perspective in the back is looking towards this advertising post. It's called a Morris column, and this all helps situate the viewer in Paris. So we know we are on the this area of Montmartre. It also, all these men reading newspapers also lets us know that we are in the center of publishing. And this was a wonderful age of publishing. A journal like Le Petit Journal sold over 1 million copies per day. So that's what people did when they weren't staring at their cell phones. There were over 17 dailies that you could choose from, and they were selling huge numbers. In addition to strolling, horseback riding was also an important part of the Parisian lifestyle, at least for the wealthy, and at least until cars ruined all the fun. In the painting on the left, we see the Bois de Boulogne. It was a fashionable street that leads to the Bois de Boulogne, a great forest where members of high society would ride their horses. Now, the artist here, George Stein, was a painter of the urban landscape, so he's very careful to situate us here near the Arc de Triomphe and show us this spectacle as it goes by. Apparently, this parade of the well-heeled and well-fashioned was such a big deal that guidebooks would advise tourists to line up and watch this daily spectacle trot past them. The Bois de Boulogne is also the setting for this lovely portrait of by Jacques-Camille Blanche depicting a family friend seated on her pony. You'll note that she is riding side saddle in a beautiful outfit, and there is a wonderful dress, a riding costume in the Frist exhibition that closely emulates that and lets you see what the fashions were for riding at the time. Now, of course, horseback riding and strolling weren't the only means of moving about the capital. Modern inventions were changing the way Parisians saw the city. Foremost among them was the bicycle, a new conveyance that appeared in the 1860s and quickly caught hold. Not only were bicycles a fun new entertainment, but they also brought about rapid social change. And ladies, we have the bicycle to thank largely for the fact that we can wear trousers today. That was so scandalous at the time, they couldn't even imagine women in pants, so they called them bifurcated garments. Because who knows what could happen. And you see her in this lovely culottes, or a bifurcated garment, and a high-necked blouse. Now, she looks pretty tame to us, right? She looks even demure and modest. But for a viewer at the time, she would be seen as a radical new woman. And these new women were members of a growing contingent of feminists who demanded equal rights and equal freedom in French society. Now, that has been a long time coming. French women didn't get the vote until 1945, but the bicycle did in fact help usher in this era of social change. The Paris Tram was another means of conveyance and is represented in this exhibition by a marvelous model to scale, dating to about 1810. I forgot, I'm sorry, I didn't put my date on here. Oh, no, 1900, it's in my notes, and I urge you to see that, as well as spending time with this magnificent painting that shows you that the hustle and bustle of Paris could also be a little overwhelming. We have a wealthy traveler here in a private carriage, one of these dangerous new women in her bifurcated garment, a bourgeois woman walking her son across the street, and an omnibus. So a wealth of opportunities and options, but also a great spectacle that made it crossing the street an adventure and a drama all in one. Let's rush now to the nightlife of Paris. If Paris really considered herself to be capital of the world, then nightlife must have been her shining jewel of her crown. The city offered not only a large number of entertainments, but also a huge variety, from the most refined theater productions to proletarian dance halls and bohemian cabarets. Here you see the very elite and very beautiful restaurant in the Bois de Boulogne called Le Pré Catalan. And it quickly became a resounding success in Belle Epoque Paris. It was known for its bucolic site, for the quality of its orchestras, not one, but more than one in this beautiful restaurant, and the refinement of the parties. Given the social prominence of the restaurant, it is not surprising that the owner commissioned this huge painting to commemorate his restaurant's starring role in Parisian dining and nightlife. Now, back in Paris, oh, here we go, and one more restaurant stop to admire the fashionable in their dining hour. Back in the heart of Paris, visitors and Parisians alike were hard-pressed to choose among the nightly spectacles. The reigning queen of the stage was Sarah Bernhardt, seen here in publicity photos, highlighting her dramatic poses. And just one more personal aside, I was about 12 years old when I first heard her name. One of my parents' friends, upon meeting me, said, "My God, she has the hair of Sarah Bernhardt." Now I don't think that was a compliment. At the time, I thought it was pretty cool, but have a look at the photographs and let me know what you think, actually. She is one of the first, she was one of the celebrities whose name is still well known today. She was truly an international celebrity. She was known as the Divine Sarah, and the work in this show really just only hints at her status and influence. You see here one of her costumes and another dramatic pose on the stage. Also a wonderful, she was quite an accomplished sculptor as well, so be on the lookout for her seaweed dagger. Now, if Sarah Bernhardt wasn't to your taste, more risque entertainment could be found at the dance halls and café-concerts in the neighborhood of Montmartre. Montmartre was on the northern edge of the city, is on the northern edge of the city, and had a reputation for bohemianism, lawlessness, and low rents. So naturally, that's where the artist turned. In this lithograph, we're seeing probably like a working class, lower class bar, dance hall, where couples would go and dance on their own. But if you wanted to see the can-can, you would go to the Moulin Rouge. And here we see the Moulin Rouge in the Toulouse-Lautrec's famous poster of 1891. The Moulin Rouge opened in the fall of 1889, and Toulouse-Lautrec went there almost every night thereafter. They featured, they had an orchestra, there were nightly performances of the can-can by professional dancers, not amateurs, and it was this wonderful risque dance featuring dancers with full skirts and long legs sheathed in black silk stockings. It was also a really, really smutty dance, make no mistake, and they had to have a censor in place to make sure that the ladies remembered to wear their undergarments. Le Père Pudeur was his name, Father Modesty. So lots of stories. This could be a whole exhibition, and it would be another talk. So let's, the Moulin Rouge, I wish we could stay here all night long, but here you see a wonderful outside view, how this fake windmill glowed in the night, drawing people to its halls. It was also a great center for slumming. So the aristocrats, like princes, visiting princes, kings, aristocrats, they would all go to the Moulin Rouge to slum with the locals. While the locals would come, the lower class, it was a great place to be a pickpocket. And it was also known as one of the liveliest flesh markets in town. Now, for those with a more bohemian bent, you might end up at the Chat Noir, which was known, it was launched in the 1880s, and it was known for its performances of the chanson realiste, the realist song, and also for this iconic black cat that served as its advertising design. Finally, our last entertainment of the evening, I want to mention the importance of the cinema, the great invention of the Lumiere brothers, who showed their first projection in 1895. Initially, movies were considered fairground attractions, but it wasn't until the very end of the Belle Époque that the first movie theater was constructed in Paris. Here you see one of the grand theaters, and it could seat over 5,500 spectators, and the cinema is one of the great enduring legacies of the Belle Époque. Now, I realize I've gone a little longer than I expected, but if you'll stay with me, I just want to conclude our talk with this return to this notion of myth, Paris as a myth. And in using the term myth, I don't mean to suggest that these things weren't real. But I want to suggest that this was a really complex, fascinating, vexing, and thrilling era, and it's become a sort of collective fantasy. And in this fantasy, Paris is, what did they say? It was a magical playground for an orgy of all human emotions, and the hard realities of the time were faded to the back. You'll notice I haven't mentioned syphilis, prostitution, anti-clericism, anti-Semitism, morphine and absinthe addiction, child labor, or colonialism tonight. Those don't get to be in the myth. This myth is of fin de siècle. Paris is a touchstone and an emblem of society in full bloom. And knowing as we do its tragic ending with World War I, this golden era, I think, is even more important for us. Now, to prove my point, I turn to the movies. And it seems that we Americans, at least, cannot have an unending appetite for films that celebrate this moment. Films such as Gigi explore the world of the upper-class courtesan in Belle Époque Paris, while French Can-Can is devoted to that most French of all dances. Whoops, oh, I think did I drop one? I did, I dropped a slide. All right, I'll just tell you about it. Not one, but two French films based on the Moulin Rouge celebrate the iconic institution that for many summed up the entire era. And more recently, there are films that have a strong element of nostalgia for the literary and artistic life of the city, as in Woody Allen's Midnight in Paris from 2011, the same year as the charming film Hugo, which will be shown here at the Frist. And although Hugo, I realize it's set in the 1930s, but key plot points revolve around the Belle Époque Paris and the invention of the cinema. Now, I hope you'll forgive me for dipping into this pop culture movie moment, but I included to point to the fact that Belle Époque Paris seems to have this indelible hold on our imaginations. Now, over 100 years since the closing of this beautiful era, The paintings, sculpture, fashion, technology, and entertainment speak to us still. Thanks to the enduring power of the art that we see next door, so beautifully installed to the frist, this vision of Paris 1900 is alive and well today. Thank you.